Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much to Eric and to the TOPRA team for allowing us to share this webinar presentation with you. And I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Suzanne Minton. I'm a Director of Content Strategy at Certara. Today's presentation is Smarter Clinical Document Augmentation Now for your transparency and disclosure requirements later. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Her name is Gabriella Mangino. Gabby is currently a product manager at Certara, where she has years of patient narrative production experience and project lead experience in the pharmaceutical industry. She works with our commercial and services groups to help develop and improve the software that supports our tech-enabled authoring capabilities. Gabby, welcome to the event. I'll now turn it over to her to begin the presentation.
Right. Thank you so much, Suzanne. And to echo Suzanne, welcome all, and thank you so much for joining me on this presentation. What we really want to speak to today is how we can create our documents proactively with a kind of smarter approach with how we're going to deal with our transparency and disclosure requirements later downstream. So as Suzanne mentioned, I'm coming from a background of narrative writing, QC and project leadership, and also from a transparency, disclosure, redaction, and anonymization work stream as well. So I'm going to kind of create a hybrid conversation around both, how we can write our clinical documents a little bit smarter with efficiency in mind from the start to help our transparency and disclosure efforts downstream. So I'm going to stop sharing my video and just go ahead and jump into the presentation. So what is transparency and disclosure? What does this really mean? So at this point in our drug submission process, we are familiar with the process of submitting our original documents, our original patient data, but also the need to kind of provide that information in a transparency and disclosure basis as well. So what are the regulations that are surrounding T&D? So we have EMA's Policy 70 and Policy 43. Policy 70 requires sponsors to publish anonymized version of CSRs, your clinical study reports, and submission documents submitted in support of any MMAs, marketing authorization applications, starting in 2015. So this regulation has been around for a few years now. And to go with this is our Policy 43. So documents which companies had assumed were submitted on a confidential basis began to be made available by the EMA on an application by any EU citizen, personnel or corporate. So we have these two regulations that are kind of driving our T&D requirements from a European standpoint. We also have Health Canada's Public Release of Clinical Information, PRCI, which requires us to make anonymized clinical information in drug submissions and medical device applications. It's making this information publicly available. We also have a new EU CTR, other FDA regulations, and policies that require us to disclose patients' information for clinical documents. And what is the impact of all of these T&D efforts that we must make post-submission? This results in the redaction or anonymization of protected personal data. So you may hear this as PPD or PPI. And this is where we are transforming a particular data field to support the anonymization of it. So if you think of anonymization as kind of an umbrella term for the ways in which we transform data to disclose data. So we can do that, create that transformation in the form of a redaction on a particular data field or an anonymization. So this could be a shuffle or a new value given to an original data field. So for example, we have an original date shown in this blue box, which is then transformed to an anonymized date. And we have an original adverse event term of pregnancy in red, which is then boxed over, or a redaction box is created over it. With this, we also have the redaction of company or commercially confidential information. So you may hear this as CCI or CBI. as well. So this is information specific to the company or the sponsor that needs to be disclosed as well, or should not be disclosed, and thus needs to be redacted. So what does transparency and disclosure actually look like in terms of working with previously submitted documents? So essentially what we'd be doing to support these efforts are reworking existing clinical documents post-submission. So we're taking those documents, those clinical study reports, SAPs, protocols, narratives, case report forms, and we are reworking them and searching for all of our PPD and our CCI information within those documents and transforming or anonymizing as appropriate. So we start to see all of these kind of industry terms incorporated into the anonymization and redaction efforts. So we have the necessity to kind of limit re-identification of patient data. We have the pseudonymization of data. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we have our CCI, then we have our anonymization, and then we have our anonymization report. So this is a report that is submitted describing the methodology of the anonymization applied on the clinical study reports. And then, of course, we always want to do everything to our document for T&D efforts with our risk in mind. Risk is the probability of re-identifying a trial participant. So oftentimes we're setting our risk threshold at 0.09, and we're running a risk assessment on our data before we are opting to redact or anonymize particular data fields within that data set. So lots of different variables, lots of different process steps in the workflow are going into reworking existing clinical documents post-submission. Ultimately, this is resulting in a proposed package for submission that may be delivered to EMA or Health Canada for an initial draft review before then the final redaction package is created. So what would this look like to actually manage a submission like this? As I mentioned, there could be so many documents that are included in these T&D efforts. And luckily, many companies at this point do have some sort of interface or technology that can support with the efforts. So in the screenshot here, this is a view of how the Certara Synchrogenics team actually goes through and combines technology with manual review efforts to apply, review, redactions, anonymizations on PDF documents or reports previously submitted, and we do this page by page. So we have an interface that allows us to go through this document page by page and create these anonymizations or redactions. Of course, there's only 11 pages shown in this example, but think about hundreds, maybe even thousands of pages needing to go through and identify PPD and CCI throughout. Then we could be working with something called anonymized data keys. So this is when we're actually feeding a data key with the original data value, and then that transformed data value or that new data value into a tool, into an interface, into the report to ultimately see those transformations made on that particular document. So in this example shown, what we've done is we've applied an age band to an old value of, say, an age of 43. That new value will instead read 40 to 50. And we've applied an offset date to all of the dates within the data set as well. So shown here are the end date or the resolution date of the adverse event. So we're working with documents, several hundreds to thousands of pages of documents, as well as all of the anonymized data. So this entire data set could be quite large. And for something like date transformations across the data set, this could extend to hundreds and thousands of dates within that data set. So why do we encounter problems with this rework? All of the required work that goes into submitting documents for transparency and disclosure purposes. The first problem could be that we are working with submission PDFs. So this is actually a requirement when you are working on documents for submission. They are the originally submitted PDFs. And because we are working with PDFs, we may experience some issues with formatting, which kind of prohibits the ability of technology to pick up date fields for us. And we could even be working with something like scanned pages. So in data fields that are, in text, in line with the text written within the document, those are usually picked up by technology. When we're dealing with kind of scanned pages or even signatures, those are items that need to be manually redacted or anonymized by a user. Another problem with rework is that it's very costly. So if you're thinking about the manual review efforts on one page times 100 times 1,000 pages, your service provider may be providing this work at a per page fee, perhaps an hourly fee, and the combination of this manual review and in using some sort of technology to support the process as well could all add up. And of course, because transparency and disclosure kind of comes at the end of the submission process, you have to think about all the costs that you have already spent on writing your clinical documents, quality control, reviewing those documents, and so on and so forth. So all of this is just an added expense that you may not have budgeted or even thought about would result in additional cost when it comes time to meet those transparency and disclosure requirements. Timely. Again, emphasizing hundreds to thousands of pages. This manual review, whether or not a technology is utilized to support this process, is very timely. And oftentimes the FDA, Health Canada, EMA are not so kind or not so friendly or flexible with the timelines that they give companies to submit transparency and disclosure requirements. So some regulations are deeming you have 6 months from the time of submission to then submit your anonymized or redacted versions of documents. Sometimes you may receive kind of a request out of the blue, or it's a submission that has slipped through the cracks and you're not compliant with the regulations and you need to submit all of your documents within only a few weeks. So thinking about going back into these documents, performing all of this work manually to meet a deadline, it can be very timely and it can be very challenging to meet a deadline. Of course, this work is very tedious. It's reviewing page by page. It's making sure that everyone's patient ID was not missed, gender, age, all of those kind of PPD data fields are not missed anywhere within the document. It is ensuring consistency across multiple documents within one submission. And it's also ensuring that any of those scanned pages or CCI or signatures, all of those things are captured as well. This is very tedious work and work that expands across several documents, some of which could be your parent study followed by the follow-on study and multiple phases of studies in which all patients are connected, referenced across all of those different reports, and that requires another level of kind of tedious anonymization that needs to be performed for consistency across those documents. So as I'm mentioning the use of technology and manual reviews, there is some sort of artificial intelligence or machine learning that is always kind of working behind your technology that is supporting these efforts. So at Certara Synchrogenics, we have kind of both of these AI and machine learning models built into the tool. And what this is enabling the tool to do is learn over time and be able to pick up particular data fields within a document and better anonymize or redact them. But no matter how smart a tool can be, it's not always perfect. And this is where we really value and emphasize the importance of manual review efforts. So a transparency specialist or redactor or anonymizer is going to go behind and manually review the work that a tech output performs to ensure we're meeting the quality and consistency standards needed in a submission. As I'm mentioning, our transparency specialists, anonymizers, redactors, these are all individuals that are on a particular team that support transparency and disclosure efforts. So this is an established team that is really needed to support this work. And it is a team that is not only familiar with the regulations and is up to speed on what the requirements are and the timelines behind meeting requirements and staying compliant, but it's also a team that can handle and manage submission size, which is usually very large and could be, applicable to multiple different drugs at the same time, multiple different submissions you need to be working with. So it's a team that needs to have the resources in place and also the knowledge and expertise in place to support this work. So with all of this in mind, with kind of all of the tedious kind of tech and manual efforts behind reworking previously submitted documents, there has to be a way that we can write smarter or think more strategically upstream while we're writing these documents to help us with our T&D efforts downstream. So medical writing efforts should always have transparency and disclosure in mind. And this is kind of one of these new ways of thinking. Several authors are kind of writing works on this in the industry, that we do want to write with transparency-friendly kind of templates and writing efforts, processes, efficiencies built in mind when we are writing our initial submission documents. So let's look at some approaches for how we can deal with PPD within our original clinical documents and how we can populate those within our templates with that T&D friendly writing in mind. So the first item we really want to always think about, emphasize, it should be on the forefront of our minds as we're writing in our templates, is we want to reduce or eliminate gender-specific pronoun references. So this would be he or she throughout a patient narrative, for example. Instead, we want to use they or the subject, the participant, the patient. Why is this important? This is important when we do determine that we need to eliminate or reduce, hide gender within a document. So when we have not only the data field within the narrative template that reads male or female, but when we have a bunch of he's and she's throughout the narrative as well, these are all items that we need to ultimately redact throughout the document when it comes time later to rework that document. So instead now we want to have a focus on reducing or eliminating all of those gender-specific references. We can also reduce or eliminate the mention of dates and only use study days. So we can still establish the same sort of temporal relationship between a study day, a dosing day, and the onset and resolution of an adverse event when we're just using study days and not using dates. So if the patient has a dose of study treatment on study day 2, and on that same day they experience rash, which is then resolved after the dose is administered on day 2, we're still correctly writing a narrative that speaks to the temporal relationship of your dose and your adverse event. So in that instance, we actually don't need to reference dates. We can just use study day. And when just using study day, down the road, we won't need to look for dates, redact dates, or even offset dates within that particular patient narrative. If we do decide to use dates within our narrative template, for example, we do want to ensure that they do not break across more than one line of text. So in this example, I've circled kind of a date that is breaking across a line, And oftentimes this break is going to interfere with a clean redaction box that can go over that one date using just one box. So this could be kind of a manual effort from someone, a user who is applying a box over that date, or it could interfere with technology or the machine learning, the artificial intelligence ability to pick up on this date, because it's not recognized as a date when it breaks across 2 lines of text. So if you are using breaks within your template, you do want to ensure that if you are using dates, that they're appearing on one line. And then another example is we want to avoid jamming text in tables in which table borders may interfere with banding or replacing text. So again, in this example is what we could see as a header in a patient narrative, which is tabular. It has a subject ID, it has some demographic information. So what we've done here is we've been able to anonymize the age of the patient. So the original age was 67. We've applied an age band over that, 60 to 69-year-old. And we've also applied kind of a generalization to the ethnicity as well. But what has happened is that because that age banding, that string of 60 to 69, that string of text is longer than the original 67 string, what it's done is it's pushed this text out of the particular table in which the text is reading. So we'll see circled that word female is breaking across that template table. So that doesn't look very clean when we're thinking about anonymizing data fields within our template. So what we could do instead is put each of these demographic data fields on a new line of text. We can organize our table a little bit differently, create more space within our table cells so that this jamming and this subsequent kind of ugly presentation of anonymization in this table doesn't occur. And then another simple approach for PPD, which is a very easy kind of approach that you can take while you're writing, is just to generalize country, generalize the country that the patient is enrolled in the study. So segueing into automating smarter. So I've been speaking to technology. It's part of my daily job at Certara Synchrogenics to think about the ways that technology can support our medical writing efforts and make our lives a lot more easy. So we want to think about automation solutions for medical writing that can be extremely beneficial to ensuring T&D success. So this is kind of our use of writing smarter in our revised templates or our T&D friendly templates, and also using automated solutions, some sort of technology or software that can support our efforts as well, which enable us to write smarter now and T&D meet our regulations for T&D smarter later. So using kind of the same case study of patient safety narratives as I've been using for this presentation. Why is this the most relevant case study? It's because patient safety narratives contain most of the PPD that we see within our submission documents. So these patient narratives appear in clinical study reports, in the appendix, and if there are 500 patients in the study and 495 of them experience a serious adverse event in that study or any other criteria necessary for writing a narrative, that means 495 individual patient safety narratives are required for writing for that particular clinical study report. So think about the volume of PPD that appears within all of those narratives. First and foremost, we want to use a transparency-friendly template. We want to write not referencing our gender. We want to write generalizing which age or country, any other demographic fields that we can. And perhaps we even want to automate our template using clinical STTM or ADAMS data. So this is the data that is used by your stats team to actually produce your listings, and your tables and your figures. Why not be able to automate your safety narrative template using this clinical data directly? And then we can also work a little bit smarter with that data as well and create an original non-transformed data narrative and an anonymized narrative at the same time. So really exciting, just kind of breaking the typical way of producing clinical documents, and that we can write an original version using our original data, our final post DBL locked clean data, and then we can also just produce a version with anonymized data at the same time. So we can do both of these efforts upstream, which will save us time, costs, frustration downstream when it comes time to submit for transparency and disclosure. So here is a view of what this template could look like. When we're submitting one now and we're saving one later, all we're doing is we're pulling in those clinical data fields into our template, and we're either using our original data or we're using anonymized data to do it. So we have technology on our side to populate these data fields for us. And of course, we onboard our regular writing quality control review team as needed. So one question for us to think about, of course, are there PPD data fields we can choose to leave out now, like our study dates, and just include days, so we don't have to redact or anonymize them later? It should always be a question on our mind when we're writing, whether it be patient narratives or its clinical study reports or its protocols, etc. So using some sort of medical writing software to support our writing now and our T&D efforts later, we're talking about Synchrogenics Writer. And this is one of Certara Synchrogenics fully licensable software that can support these efforts directly. And in this following demo, I'm actually going to show you a real world example using a patient safety narrative. Let me go ahead and switch my screen and have us jump right into the demonstration. So using this software is going to enable me to proactively write my patient safety narratives now using my original clinical study data, and also produce a version with anonymized data throughout the document as well. So jumping right into my project, let me guide you through a few different examples of templates. So first, we're going to start with our original template kind of sample, which is our demographic summary portion of a patient narrative. So in this very first paragraph, very first statement alone in a patient safety narrative, this is going to have a majority of our PPD or our patient information within this one template location. So in this particular example, we're working with a few different demographic data fields, a few different PPD fields. So we have our participant ID, we have our age and our age unit, we have our race, we have our ethnicity, we have our sex, we have our study ID, and then we have the name of our serious adverse event. So in my original template here, you'll see the data fields that I have populated my template with from my clinical data, from my SDTM data. And in my preview below, I see this data actually populated within my template. So the green text is representing that data from the clinical data set. And then the black text is my standard template language, template text. So I'll see all my demographic information here, followed by the criteria event that that patient meets, which is cataract, worsening of bilateral cataracts on November 12th, 2015, which is study day 316. So I see this patient. This patient is on my particular subject list that I've created for meeting criteria in this original data set. So this is my kind of original, let's call it our non-transparency and disclosure friendly template. Why is it not T&D friendly? Because it has my age, it has my race, ethnicity, it has my gender, my sex, it has also the preferred term of my adverse event, and it has the start date. So let's take a look at instead on the total opposite spectrum, what this anonymized patient safety narrative would look like. So the only thing I've done different for this particular example is I've went and I've anonymized my data set. So what I've done is I've fed kind of anonymization rules to my data set. So I've said I want to apply an age band to my age. I want to generalize country. And I fed this anonymized data key into my tool. So now what I want to do is I want to switch my particular subject list to all those new subjects that have been anonymized. And I want to kind of see what this anonymized data would look like in my new revised template. So the first thing you'll probably notice is this subject has a different ID. And that's exactly what we want. So what we've done in this particular data set to transform the patient ID is we've applied a shuffle. So a shuffle is assigning a patient another patient's ID within that same data set. So if you remember, this is my old patient ID, and now the same patient has been assigned this new ID. So in my preview, I see a new patient ID. What else do I see changed in my preview? I now see an age band on that patient's original age. I now see a race field, which is not here anymore. So what I've done is I've actually removed race entirely, and I've just kept my data to showing not Hispanic or Latino, my ethnicity. And what else have I done? What other transformation have I made? So you'll see that instead of using my original preferred term here, I actually used the system organ class of that particular adverse event to display here. So instead of seeing the worsening of bilateral cataracts being my AE preferred term, I now only see eye disorders as my adverse event. So this is kind of my anonymized version of that AE. And I also don't see my date anymore. Now I only see my study day. So date has been entirely eliminated, and I only see that event as having started on study day 316. So what would a hybrid version now look like? So think about the hybrid version of your narrative as the narrative that you're writing to support T&D efforts downstream by eliminating some of those data fields in demographics, those PPD fields that will require a redaction or anonymization down the road, but you want to limit those instances throughout your narrative template as you're writing. So this could be your hybrid version. So what we're looking at in this example, switch back to my original list, is kind of the best of both worlds. So we have our original patient ID, we have our original age, we have our ethnicity, but we don't have our race. We've eliminated sex as well. We've kept our AE term, but we've eliminated date and we've just retained study day. So this is a lot more transparency and disclosure friendly than our original template. And the best part about using some sort of technology to support your writing efforts earlier from the onset as you're performing your medical writing is that you do have a view of all of the data at your fingertips while you're working. And this is really great when we do want to see kind of our original versus our anonymized data and the differences between both, and also performing that quality control review and assurance that we're using the data across our templates in the correct places and using both our original and anonymized data throughout the process. So if you think about how this template would actually complete the subsequent writing steps needed. So this is just one little piece of a patient narrative template. Of course, you would populate all of the remaining template sections, whether it be tables, more event summary details, lab tables, things of that nature. You would complete that full narrative template. And then ultimately, you're generating that template out of the software. So you're seeing your clinical study data within that template. You're seeing your surrounding template text. And everything is consistent, cohesive, standardized across all of your patients that require those patient narratives for submission. So then what happens when you actually want to also generate anonymized versions of that document? So it's a simple click of a button to generate your original version and then your anonymized version. So all of the data will be updated. You'll see the change in the different data code, field code used in this particular template section, signifying anonymized versus your original data. So you could essentially have two versions of a narrative generated at the same time, in the same kind of level of effort now, to prevent that rework, the need to revisit those narratives later when it comes time for submission.